This is an interview with Carrie Hamilton Lock for the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's Oral History Project. I'm Horace Huntley. We're at Miles College. Today is October 18, 1995. Thank you, Mrs. Lock, for coming out to sit with us today to talk about the movement.
Thank you. You're welcome.
We know that you were a young person during the time of the struggle, and what we're trying to do is sort of piece together this story of Birmingham and the movement. But at first, I would like to just start by asking you some sort of general questions about your family.
Okay.
Just a couple of things about your parents. Where are your parents from?
My parents are both from Birmingham, Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
I was born and raised in the Rising area, mm-hmm. which is most notably for Rickwood Ballpark is the area.
Yes. And your parents were born in Birmingham, and you were born in Birmingham. Did you have brothers and sisters?
Yes, I did. I have an older sister, Cheryl. Mm-hmm. Then I'm the second in line, Carrie. My brother, William. My brother, Bernard. And my sister, Nancy.
Does all of them still live in Birmingham?
Everybody lives here except Nancy.
Oh, okay. Where does Nancy live?
Nancy lives in Illinois.
Oh, okay. Just tell me just a bit about your parents. How much education did they have? Did they go to high school and to college?
My mother and father both went to Parker High School, and my father was a minister. He was minister at First Baptist Church in Inslee. He also worked and retired from the U.S. Postal Service. He was a mail handler here in Birmingham and retired after 20-something years.
Mm-hmm. I see. Did your mother work outside of the home?
My mother did work outside of the home. She worked as a nurse, and she was involved in our child rearing. But I would have to say that my father was an early Mr. Mom. He took care of the kids. He did the cooking. He did the washing. Okay. He did the ironing.
So you sort of laid the foundation for me because I was one of those house husbands for a while myself. Tell me a bit about your education. Where did you start first grade, for instance?
I started first grade at Brighton Elementary School, and I went there for the first and the second grade. Mm-hmm. I can remember my first grade teacher was Mrs. Austin.
Mm. You seem as if you remember Mrs. Austin, have fond memories of her.
I have all fond memories of my childhood.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And you moved from Brighton, and then what school did you attend? To
Princeton Elementary School.
Okay. And Princeton, was Princeton an integrated school at the time?
No, it was all black at the time.
Okay.
Princeton School remains in 1995 to be a premier elementary school now. Mm-hmm. And during the time that I went to school, it was a very good school, and the community was always involved. We had a principal, Miss Lucille Boyd, Ms. Boyd, Miss Catherine Smith, our teachers. They were all involved with the kids. I had no idea that we were poor because back then everything was based on integrity instead of money. So my parents had plenty of integrity. I thought we were rich.
Maybe you were, in comparison. Tell me just a bit about your community, the community of Rising. How do you remember Rising as a child growing up in that community?
The foremost thing that I remember about Rising, that it was 4 blocks east and west and 4 blocks north and south. And so that was our world. We had 4 blocks by 4 blocks, and we were a very closely knit community. All of the parents knew each other. My parents worked, both of my parents worked all the time. My mother and father would leave very early and come back very late, but all the neighbors were in charge of us, so that if anything happened, rest assured the neighbors were going to tell.
What kind of occupations did your neighbors have? Do you remember what kind of work was done by most of the people in the community?
During the 50s and the 60s, neighbors would be the gamut of teachers, nurses' aides, domestics, proud domestics, the people that I knew as portermen were proud people. They had worked to send their children to whatever schooling that they were going to go through, business schooling at that time. I just remember a dignified lifestyle during that time.
You went to Parker High School initially, is that
Oh,
correct?
yes, 9th grade.
Tell me about that experience. Why did you decide to go to Parker High School?
Because I was spoiled. My grandmother and grandfather lived in the Smithfield area. And at my grandmother's house, I had my own room. I had all the privileges that an only child has. My grandfather was a minister, and he always wore a black suit, a white shirt, and a black tie. And he would take me to school and have me sit in the back. And he would get out and come around the side. It was like I had a chauffeur. So, of course, all the kids thought we were rich. And, of course, we were not. But everybody thought that my grandfather was my chauffeur.
This is at Parker?
This is at Parker.
Okay.
And when we got out at 3 or 3:30 or whatever time school let out, he would stand on the sidewalk and stand there very proud, open the door and stand and wait for me to get in. I felt like a princess.
Mm-hmm. Where was your older sister?
They were at home.
Okay. She was out of school already?
No, my older sister is only, she's less than 2 years older
So
than
did she
I
go
am.
to
So she
Parker
was
as
at
well?
Parker, yes.
Okay, but she lived with your mother and father, and you lived with the grandparents?
Well, just for a little while. When I would get mad at my parents, I would go to my grand. Just like kids are today.
Okay. Playing the ends against the middle.
That's right. I was real good at it.
Well, after your 9th grade at Parker, tell me, what do you remember about Parker as a school?
I remember fun times. I remember that coming from Princeton Elementary School, which is a very small school, and going to Parker, I thought, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened to me. It was so big, it was so huge, I was such an adult. I just thought this was the greatest thing in the world. Most of the people there knew my parents. The teachers knew my dad and my mom. So we couldn't get away with anything because people would call your parents then. You didn't dare get in trouble because that would just be the end of it. I felt very special there. I worked for the principal, so I had my own principal's pass. My teachers were very good. I was a freshman representative to the student council, so I got a chance to go to assembly on a weekly basis and stand on the stage. That was very important.
So you were a very active person in your formative years.
I suppose, but back then I didn't think so. I mean, you don't think about it. It wasn't conscious.
You were a freshman at Parker in 1963.
1963, that's correct.
During the demonstration.
Yes.
Were your parents actively involved in the movement?
Yes, they were. My parents would go to the mass meetings at 16th Street Baptist Church. My father was minister. My grandfather was minister. And at that time, all ministers were focal characters in the movement. They kept the community abreast of what would be going on and what should be going on. But I think the thing that I remember the most about Parker High School was standing in the principal's office when Kennedy was killed, and back to back to back to back, so many people were dying. I was always a kid that was interested in the news. I liked...
What do you mean back to back to back people were dying?
People were dying in Mississippi. I remember when Medgar Evers was killed. I remember when the 3 civil rights workers died in Mississippi. Miss Louise Yo.
Yes.
I remember that as a child. I remember when Denise McNair, Addie Collins, the other girls were killed at 16th Street Baptist Church.
How did that impact upon you as a young person, the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church?
If I can remember, it was on a early September morning, on Sunday morning in September. And the blast shook our house, even though we lived very far away. And the news came by telephone. People ran out in the streets. They were screaming. They were hollering.
What community did you live in when the bomb?
I lived by Rickwood Ballpark. I lived in the Rising. Yeah.
Okay.
But it shook our house. And everybody wondered, what in the world? It was so loud. And then we were told what had happened. Nobody could believe it, because the civil rights era was one thing, but murder was something else. And I could remember that the young Wesley girl, her father had been my teacher, my principal at Princeton Elementary School. And Chris McNair had taught at Parker. So these were people that I knew, if not the children, I knew their parents, or I knew who their parents were. It was utter disbelief. Nobody believed that even white people were so low down, so hateful, so spiteful, that they would kill children. And after they did kill the children, they weren't sorry.
What kind of impression did that leave on you about white people in general? Did you look at white people in general, or did you look at this as an isolated case?
No, it was not isolated, because we were as children, we were very aware of whites. We were very aware of the two worlds that we lived in, the black world, the white world. My parents always had Ebony magazine around, and Jet magazine, and we understood. We knew about Emmett Till, the man that had been, the young boy that had been killed and his body mutilated. We knew about lynchings. We were very aware of how black people disappeared, never to be heard of again. How black men would be shot in the back, walking the streets, and the police would say they were shot in self-defense because these people were robbing or killing. We were very aware of the terrible things that were happening in the black community. But as children, we were not afraid.
What was the relationship, as you remember, between your community and the Birmingham Police Department? Do you ever remember any incidences in your community between the police and individuals in your community?
I never saw the police in our community. We lived in a very quiet community, a community of a family community. As a matter of fact, when I was in the 8th grade, I never knew anybody that was divorced. None of my friends' parents were divorced. I didn't know what that meant. We might have been poor people, but we were proud people with dignity. I remember that if there were ever any conflicts in the community, that they would come to the men, my dad, other men. If young boys had gotten in trouble, their parents threatened to tell my dad. Other fathers, they would be in big trouble. At that time, all men disciplined all the children.
Are you suggesting there were not children in your community that lived with just their mother or their grandmother and a father was not in the home? Do you remember?
I don't remember anybody that didn't have a father at home. I just don't remember anybody that didn't have two parents. And during most cases, most grandparents were still inside the house or next door.
Right. So it was an all-inclusive kind of community, and those extended families, because you actually had people in your community with just like family who may not have been blood relatives. Is that correct?
Exactly. Well, we were just recently, my mother and I were talking, and I said, you know, when you're young, you don't question anything. There were people that I called Aunt so-and-so or Cousin so-and-so, and you never really knew if they were blood relatives or not. It didn't matter,
Right.
but you didn't question it.
You mentioned that your father and your mother, I assume, were actively involved in the struggle. You did say that all ministers were spokespersons for the movement, but there were some ministers that did not participate, but your father and your grandfather obviously did. Can you tell me the extent of their involvement in the movement at the time?
My father had a very personal stake in the movement. My father was very outspoken. He was not afraid of white people. He always said what was on his mind, and it often got him in trouble.
For instance, how did he get
For
that?
example, when we were very small children, maybe I was 6 or 7, we were on the way to the hospital to pick my mother up from the hospital, and the police stopped my father, and they got really smart. They said something about, "Get out of the car, boy." And of course, the children, we were on the back seat, and my dad said, "Who are you calling boy?" And the cop says, "You're going to be in trouble." My dad said, "If you put your gun on top of the car and fight me fair, I'll show you who a boy is." And they took him to jail. I can remember that it was cold, that it was very damp, raining, and the police left us standing on the sidewalk. My mother had just come out of the hospital. We'd never made it home. They left us there, children, small children, and my mother was not dressed. She didn't have a coat. She was coming from the hospital. And they took my father to jail, but he was not afraid. Whenever people got in trouble in the community, my father, along with some of the other men, there were 4 or 5 men, young men, that everybody came to when somebody was in trouble. None of these men were afraid of whites. They were not afraid. They were protectors of the community. If something happened, they would take care of it.
Were your parents involved with the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights prior to the 63 demonstrations? Do you remember if they were or not?
I can remember slipping off to maybe 2 meetings without our parents knowing about it. But after the bombing, it was a nightly ritual. Whenever the mass movement was called, everybody was there.
Okay, well, prior to the bombing, in April, the bombing was in September.
Yes.
In April and May, there were marches practically every day. Were you involved in that?
We were downtown. I can remember the particular march at Newberry's downtown. I look at Newberry's today and I see its ruin. I see the plight of the building, and I just remember, and if you're quiet enough, you can hear the water, you can hear the people screaming still, you can hear the dogs. And I said, why? Why?
You, of course, at that point was a teenager, a young teenager at the time. So.
I was probably about 12 then, or 13.
And what do you remember about firstly about the mass meetings? How would you describe the mass meetings that you attended?
They were very intense. Even as a child, you knew that there was something special in the air. At the meetings, it was like church, but it was different from church. I can remember on the stage, Dr. King, Mrs. King, Fred Shuttlesworth, Jesse Jackson, Julian Bond. Julian Bond and Jesse Jackson were young boys. They didn't look much older than we were, but they were there. And Reverend Woods and other people that I can't remember their names. There was another older gentleman. They called him Sunshine. He's dead now. Sunshine was always close to my parents, and he kept us all informed of what was going on. I can remember when they bombed Attorney Shore's home. And so every day there was something to let black people know that they were not safe. They would intimidate our parents and tell them, if you go to these meetings, you're not going to have a job. Well, the jobs that they had, they couldn't make a living for their children anyway, so it didn't matter. They would sit on the porch at night, my father and other men with shotguns and rifles. They would sit on the front porch all night just to make sure that white people didn't harm us. They would go to other communities and band together and watch over the houses to make sure that people were not bombed in their sleep.
Were your parents or your home ever threatened? Did people ever call your home? Why were they sitting on the porch? I assume that was on your porch.
On everybody, on every
community.
There was somebody in every block. After I went to West End, they sat up all night across the street from our house, in the back of our house, on the side of our house.
Now, going to West End, that means that you transferred then from Parker High School to West End High School. But before we get to West End High School, let me just ask you just a couple other questions about the movement itself. You, in 1963, participated in demonstrations. Did you also participate in any of the classes and the training sessions that were done with young people that were going to demonstrate?
I don't think they were called classes necessarily, but we would sit in church as though it was church, and they would tell us what to do. The strategists were the men. They would say, we're going to walk down this street, and when the police come, then we'll come from the other street. And when the other police come, we'll come. They were very smart. As a child, I loved the meetings because I always thought black people were smarter than the cops because they were always surprised. And I can remember that they would always send somebody to infiltrate the meeting, and how Dr. King would stand on the podium and call them out. It was though he knew who the Judas was.
And a black person that would be sent?
A black person that would be sent in. We called them the Uncle Toms. The people that would, or some, I can't say that, I can't label all people that. There were some people there for whatever reason that the white man would demand that they report back, that they would bring back information. And for whatever reason, they had to do it.
These individuals were known to be...
Some were known and some were unknown. I just remember that Dr. King would speak to them as Judas, and then there were whites that would stand in the back of the church and take notes. I can remember Bull Connor as a child, and the police, that they would be outside of the church. They were very visible. They always wore sunglasses. You could see the malice on their faces. You knew that they meant you harm. But they were very bold about infiltrating the church. They didn't have any respect. But we prevailed.
Tell me about, what do you remember about participating in demonstrations?
Some of us went because it was fun. Until the 4 children were killed. When you're very young, you don't know why, but you're caught up in the emotions. My parents talked to us. They knew that something would come, eventually come. I'm not saying that they had the foresight to see what eventually did happen, but I knew they wanted something better for their children.
Do you ever remember being in a demonstration and being attacked by the police or by the firemen?
No, I remember just being in the crowds and running. To say that I was bitten by a dog, no. To say that I was knocked down by the water hoses, no. But we were in the crowds when the dogs were turned loose. We were in the crowds when the water was turned on, but there were so many people. I can remember when they would pick demonstrators up, and we were still very young. So it was the older children, the high school children, that went to jail. I can remember when all of the city jails were full, then they started putting people in the Bessemer jails. And when the Bessemer jails were full, they started putting people in the, I think they put them in Fair
Park.
Fair Park, yes, Fair Park. Every conceivable facility. And by this point, blacks had come to realize that going to jail was no big deal. There was nothing criminal about it. So I knew older teenagers who would go to jail and be released and go back the same night to get arrested again.
But you were never arrested?
I was never arrested there.
Okay. But you were arrested?
later on, I had my share.
And did you go to St. Augustine, I believe? You participated in St. Augustine?
No.
Okay. Let me just take this a step further then. When you finished your freshman year at Parker, then you decided, or your parents decided, or you decided collectively to go to West End. How was that decision made?
Well, Dr. King asked all the children, all the students, to integrate the schools. And there were 22 signed up for West End. There were other numbers signed up to the other schools, but specifically I remember 22 signed up for West End.
This is in 63, 64 school year.
63, 64, 65 school year.
Okay. And there were 22 that signed up.
22.
How many?
The night before, the Sunday night before.
Okay. How many showed up on Monday morning?
1.
And that was you. How did you get there?
My father drove us, my mother, my father, and myself. When we arrived, I can remember the Klan marching down the sidewalk in their hoods and their robes. And I believe this was the first time that I had seen the Klan.
How many? Do you remember the numbers? Were there others that were there that were not members of, did not have?
There were mobs there. Okay. There were mob scenes, but I will always remember the robes and not being afraid. And the closer we got to the school, I felt privileged. I felt honored. I was not afraid. Maybe I should have been afraid, but I was not afraid because I had my father there. And I can remember to get to the school door, we had to say, "Excuse me, excuse me." And they didn't want to let us through, and they would say, "Nigger, go home. Nigger, nigger. Go home, nigger." And the more they said that, the prouder I got, and the more I held my shoulders back, and I smiled. But there were a lot of angry whites there. My father and my mother had talked to me, and they said that the West End area was a poor area, and that's where poor white trash lived, and that we were better than that. We were better. Those people were acting that way because they didn't know any better. My mother and father prepared me for what would happen, but they had no idea as to what really happened.
What would happen when you finally get into the school and you go to the office? Do you remember the reception that you received from the principal and from those that worked in the office?
I remember the principal being very old and very nervous. He was probably thinking that no blacks would come, that we wouldn't dare come. And then I showed up, and inside the school it was chaos. The children were very mean. They yelled, "Nigger," but I had heard that so much, it didn't matter.
Inside the classroom, this was going on, and what did the teachers do when these kinds of incidents would take place?
If you don't have leadership at the top, if the principal does not say, "We will not tolerate outbursts," if the principal does not say, "We're just going to accept the situation," what happened was just awful. I can remember in the classrooms that all the children, all the students, if there were 20, 25 kids in one class, they would all sit in the front row, 2 and 3 to one seat, and then they would leave 4 rows, and then I would sit on the last row. And there would be 4 empty rows between us. And I could not go to the restroom when the other students went to the restroom. I had a special time to go to the restroom.
A specially designated time?
A special designated time, whether I had to or not. And one particular day when I was in the 10th grade, I had to go. And I had to go at the time when the other kids were in there also. And I remember that this was the first time that I had had new books. I had brand new books for the first time. And one of the students knocked my books over in a sink full of water. Well, heaven and hell couldn't help her right then. I didn't care. I beat her from A to Z, and I didn't care.
Were just the 2 of you in the bathroom at the time?
No, there were many girls in there, but I would have taken care of all of them. It was the first time in my life that I had brand new books. My father had probably taken his whole 2-week salary to pay for my books. I was so proud. They were wrapped in newspaper. I had trimmed the newspaper and bound the books. I was so careful not to get any scratches on them, no dirt. They were protected because they were new books.
What happened as a result of the fight?
Well, I'm sure the white girl wished that she hadn't started that. She said, I told her to pick them up, and she knocked them on the floor again. I said, pick them up. And she said something about she didn't listen to a nigger. Something about a nigger. After that, I don't remember, except that when I finished with her, you couldn't really tell what she was made of. But we were both sent to the principal's office, and the principal expelled me. And I called my dad. My dad came to get me. And when I got home, we called 16th Street Baptist Church, and my dad called Washington, and he talked to Kessenbach, and they sent somebody there. There were 3 white men that came that night.
To your home?
To my home. And they wanted to know what happened, and I told them. They wanted to be very sure that I hadn't initiated the fight.
This was the night of the fight?
This was the night of the fight.
Oh, okay. And will you return? Did you go back the next day?
I cannot remember if I went back the next day, but this was a very critical point because whites didn't know how they were going to handle the situation in the schools. There were no rules. They really didn't know how to handle it.
Were you the only black child at the school?
I was the only black child there, and it seems like 2,000 of them, but it was probably no more than 300 or 400 students
West
there.
End was a pretty large school.
Was it?
So
it seemed like
about
it.
2,000.
Then probably so.
It was West End and Woodlawn were huge schools, so they probably were very, very large classes, I would assume, as well. Then, upon the return, do you remember when you returned to school what your reception was?
The principal was very angry because
With you?
he was very angry. The attorney general had sent people, I don't know who the white men were, to the school to talk to him. He didn't want that. It would have been very easy to suspend me, get rid of me, and never see me again. But my father said no. He asked me, can you handle it? My father would always ask me, can you handle it? But he knew that I could. I knew that he expected me to, and I knew that somebody had to do it.
What was the reaction of your other brothers and sisters to your attending and having to go through what you were going through? Were they aware of what was happening at the time?
Of course they were aware.
What were their reactions?
They were my brothers and sisters. They were supportive. Whatever had to be done is exactly what we did. My brothers were younger, and perhaps they did not understand as much, but my sister did. My sister was fearful for me. My sister was very protective of me. They were always fearful that something might happen to me. If the other kids were let out of school at 3, then my dad had to pick me up at 2:30. I was never allowed to go out of the door when they were going out of the door.
For the entire 3 years that you were
For
there?
the entire 3 years that we were there. They said they couldn't protect me.
Okay. So you graduated. When you graduated, how many black students were at West End at that time?
There were a total of 3. There was one girl to graduate in 1967. There were 2 of us graduating. And I can't remember if Vera Marcus was in the 10th grade, I believe, at that time.
Mm-hmm. When you graduated?
When I graduated.
And Patricia Marcus?
Patricia Marcus, her sister, had gone to West End in 1963 and graduated.
Okay. Were there no boys, no black males
No.
involved in the school at all?
No.
Very, very interesting. That must have been a very trying time in your life. How did that experience impact upon the rest of your life?
I grew up fast. I matured probably faster than the kids around me. It made me very strong. It made me very bitter, but it made me very proud, and I knew that I had been set aside. I knew that for whatever reason, whatever would come in my life, that I'd be able to handle it. That if I had gone through that I could handle anything.
After high school, what did you do?
After high school, I went to Tuskegee Institute. I graduated on Sunday afternoon, and the next Sunday afternoon, I was leaving for college. That had nothing to do with West End. At Princeton Elementary School, in 5th grade, we knew where we were going to go to college. Our teachers had told us where we were going to go to college. We knew all about Tuskegee, while other students were procrastinating and wondering and trying to see if they were accepted. I knew in 5th grade where I was going to go to school. By the time we were in 7th grade, I think our teachers had probably already filled out our applications for college in our minds. Mrs. Catherine Eileen Smith, had gone to Tuskegee, and she would say, "Class, these are the songs that you will sing at Tuskegee, and these are the things that you will do at Tuskegee. And of course, this is what you'll have to wear at Tuskegee." And everybody went to Tuskegee.
So you were programmed for Tuskegee.
We were programmed. I never applied anywhere else.
What was the transition like from your high school days to Tuskegee?
It was glory, hallelujah. It was wonderful to be around black people, to be around people going to college, period. Mm-hmm. It was a new day. It was a proud day. It was just wonderful.
Mm-hmm. And did you graduate from Tuskegee?
No, I didn't.
Okay. How long did you spend?
I spent 2 years at Tuskegee.
Mm-hmm. And it's very obvious that there are very fond memories of that. From Tuskegee, where did you go?
From Tuskegee, I got married and I moved to Georgia, I believe, to Atlanta. And then I lived 3 years in Germany. And from Germany, I came back to Chicago, and I finished Northeastern Illinois University.
Mm-hmm. And now you have a master's degree, right? Mm-hmm. In what area and where did you?
In public administration and business.
And you did that in Illinois?
No, at University of Texas.
Mm-hmm. San Antonio.
San Antonio, okay. Yeah.
Well, that's a tremendous story because what we're seemingly is happening with people who grew up in Birmingham and was involved in the movement, it appears that, just as you said, there's maturity there, mm-hmm. based upon those times that led you to be successful in other areas. I assume that's because of the fortitude that you developed.
Well, I don't know about successful, but you sure learn how to survive. You sure don't know that N-O is in the vocabulary. You sure don't know that can't isn't in the dictionary. You don't know that you can't do things. You're certainly not intimidated by people because you face Satan himself every day. You don't know anything but to just do it. Just do it.
This has been a very rewarding hour that we've spent together. Is there anything else that we have not covered that you would like to share with us in relationship to those days?
I would like for the young people to not take those days for granted. I would like for those young people to realize that the world that they enjoy came at somebody's sacrifice. My life was better because people died before I had to go through those doors. I'm saddened when I see West End High School now. I'm saddened by the way the children act today, that they don't take their education seriously. I'm saddened. I'm very saddened at the children's mentality that they don't know that they can achieve. I'm saddened when they don't want to go to college. I'm saddened when they go to college and it's not important to them. They must know that everything came at somebody's sacrifice. That's what I want them to know. Somebody bled, somebody cried, and somebody died for you.
Very well stated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm there was there. was nice.